This is BBC Television from London. Diana, Princess of Wales, has died after a car crash in Paris. The French government announced her death just before 5 o'clock this morning. In a statement, Buckingham Palace said, "The Queen and the Prince of Wales are deeply shocked and distressed by this terrible news. Normal programmes have been suspended while we bring you the latest news and reaction." Diana, Princess of Wales, has died after a car crash in Paris. She was taken to a hospital in the city early this morning. Surgeons spent 2 hours trying to save her life, but she died at 4 o'clock from severe chest injuries. Diana, Princess of Wales, had been a passenger in a car which crashed in a tunnel next to the River Seine. Her friend, Dodi Fayed, and the driver were also killed. The accident happened as test photographers pursued the princess's car through a tunnel under the Place de l'Alma in the centre of the city. The princess's Mercedes hit a road pillar and smashed into a wall. 7 photographers were arrested after the incident. Tributes to Diana, Princess of Wales, have been coming in. A spokesman for the Archbishop of Canterbury said the prayers of the Archbishops of Canterbury and York will be with the families of Diana, Princess of Wales, and Mr. Al Fayed at this tragic moment. Cardinal Hume, leader of the Roman Catholic Church in England and Wales, said, "I'm greatly distressed at the news of Princess Diana and the awful suddenness in which it came upon us all." A spokesman for Mother Teresa of Calcutta said she was very sorry and that she was praying for the princess. There's been reaction from politicians here. The Prime Minister said he was utterly devastated. The whole of our country, all of us, will be in a state of shock and mourning. The leader of the opposition, William Hague, said he was absolutely shocked. The whole nation will be in shock and in tears at this awful news. The Liberal Democrat leader, Paddy Ashdown, said, "I'm speechless with shock at the horror and sadness of this terrible tragedy." And tributes have been paid by world leaders. President Clinton said he and his wife were profoundly saddened by this tragic event. And the Australian Prime Minister, John Howard, said the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, will shock and sadden Australians. The owner of Harrods, whose son died in the car crash, said the deaths were appalling and quite needless. The world, he said, had lost a princess who is simply irreplaceable. And I'm joined in the studio now by Alison Holt, now reports.
Twisted almost beyond recognition, the wreckage of the Mercedes in which the princess was travelling. The crash happened shortly after midnight. According to eyewitnesses, the car hit a wall in a tunnel on one of the fast-flowing roads which runs alongside the River Seine. They were apparently being pursued at high speed by photographers on motorbikes. Within minutes of the crash, the area was sealed off as police and ambulance teams struggled to reach the 4 trapped inside. Dodi Al Fayed, the princess's constant companion in recent weeks, was dead at the scene, as was their chauffeur. The princess and her bodyguard had to be cut from the wreckage. Both were taken to hospital with serious injuries. But those who witnessed the aftermath of the accident knew the gravity of what they were seeing.
We saw a large blue Mercedes, darker blue, and the airbag on the passenger side was deployed. And we saw a lot of liquid on the ground, and we didn't know who it was at the time. Somebody came running towards us, speaking French, shouting in French, and we thought for some reason it was going to blow up in the tunnel. We stood there, watched a little bit, and police came about 7 to 10 minutes later, ambulance about 15 minutes later.
At the hospital, there was no word on the princess's condition for several hours. But inside, doctors were fighting to save her. She had severe internal injuries and underwent emergency surgery. But just before 5 o'clock this morning, the French Interior Minister Jean-Pierre Chevènement broke the tragic news that the princess had died.
Au nom du gouvernement français,
he expressed the regret of the French people, but it was the British ambassador to Paris who voiced the deep shock and sorrow that was felt by all.
And our thoughts and our prayers are with her family and her friends, and with the family and friends of the others who died in the accident.
Immediately after the crash, police took away a motorbike for further investigation. The high-speed chase with photographers on bikes pursuing the car is thought to have begun as the couple left the Ritz Hotel, where they'd been having dinner. The hotel belongs to Mr. Al Fayed's father, and the man driving them was a security agent from the Ritz. Mr. Fayed's spokesman says the whole family is devastated.
I've spoken to Mr. Al-Fayed, and his view is that this is an appalling and quite needless tragedy. The world has lost a princess who is simply irreplaceable, and Mr. Al-Fayed has lost his beloved eldest son. Mr. and Mrs. Al-Fayed are devastated by their loss, and they share the sorrow of the princess's family.
Police have already begun gathering evidence for their investigation into what happened, and 7 photographers have been arrested. Political reaction to the tragedy was swift. The first came from the other side of the world, where the Foreign Secretary is visiting the Philippines.
I am greatly shocked by this news. Our first thoughts must be with her children and with her family at this time of immense loss to them. I was fortunate to have the opportunity of working with the Princess on her international charity work. I believe what has happened is a tragic loss at a young age of someone who'd shown great courage and commitment in drawing attention to serious issues. For the next few days, her family and the nation must have time to come to terms with their immense sadness and loss. In the longer term, serious questions will need to be asked as to whether the aggressive intrusion into her privacy has contributed to this tragedy.
She was an incredible figure. She had real star quality, as we will all never forget, and she used her position to do a great deal of good on drug issues, on AIDS issues, and so on. Of course, she was from time to time a controversial figure. I think it's, as Robin Cook has said, people will need to ask questions about intrusion into private life, but it's also too early to draw any general conclusions from one terrible incident.
The nation will be speechless with the tragedy of this event and the horror of it, and like everybody else, I'm sure we'll want to extend our sympathy and our prayers and our thoughts to her closest family, clearly the princes and the Prince of Wales, and the wider family beyond that, together with, of course, Mr. Al-Fayed. This is an event, the tragedy of which I think supersedes any other kind of comment you can make at the moment.
Those are questions which will be asked in coming days, but at the moment the investigation has only just begun, and few have yet grasped the full impact of this tragedy. Alison Holt, BBC News.
I'm joined in the studio now by the royal biographer Anthony Holden, who knew the princess well. Tony, the princess was in a curious position. She was of the royal family, part of the royal family, and yet in a sense not fully part of the royal family. How would you assess the effect that her death will have on other members of the family?
Well, I think it'll have a devastating impact on all, particularly, of course, her sons. All our thoughts go to them this morning above all else. I think every family in the land will actually feel a sense of loss, as if a loved one or even a member of the family. She was that kind of princess. She was an icon. The Queen and the senior members, Prince Charles, it's too early yet to talk about funerals, but there will have to be a properly royal funeral. Whether or not it'll be a state occasion, how public it'll be, we don't yet know. But there is an irony in the fact that just a year ago this week she was, as it were, expelled from the royal family, and only last week she was very intent, through sympathetic journalists like myself, to make it clear that certain things she was doing, the interview with Le Monde, the romance with Dodi, she's not a member of the royal family anymore. A lot of newspapers and Tory politicians were saying she was and criticising her for that reason. In her head she wasn't. They'll wonder if they handled it right a year ago, I think.
How do you assess the role of the Princess of Wales in the public life of this country?
Well, she'd begun to reinvent the role of royalty. Several of your contributors this morning have mentioned that very important moment when she shook hands with an AIDS victim at a time when AIDS was not properly understood. And that seemed to me at the time to be precisely what royalty was about, getting across to people something as important as that, something as symbolic as that, at a time when a government advertising campaign wasn't working very well. I think it's appalling that she just seemed to be hitting her stride again after the long trauma of the divorce, a year for readjustment, beginning to feel a little bit more independent in her private life, to take risks and do rather bravura things, and in her public life. And the half dozen or so causes close to her heart that she retained after dropping those 100 charities the landmines campaign had self-evidently been successful. It had converted governments on both sides of the Atlantic. The leprosy, the heart, the cancer, the amounts of money she was able to raise. She was reinventing royalty in a 21st century image.
Do you think that she occasionally took one risk too many? Or is it part of what she was about, that she had to push boundaries?
To me, that was very much part of her charm, yes. She was very much her own public relations advisor. There was occasional talk about the Tim Bells of this world lurking behind her. It wasn't true at all. She had an instinct for these things, and occasionally she could make mistakes, and the recovery would be extraordinary, and they called her the Teflon Princess because nothing ever, she seemed to be able to get away with anything that other members of the royal family might not. She just really was changing the whole way these things work, and was going to be, for the rest of her life, an enormous force for good in this country and around the world. And it's a huge loss, the scale of which we've really yet to appreciate.
And how do you assess the developing relationship that she had with the Al Fayed family, who are, in a sense, on the outskirts of British society?
Well, this is naturally a great tragedy for them as well, and all our sympathies go to them. I think the really interesting thing for those who were surprised by her showing such involvement with this family, with father and son in their different ways, was that the Fayeds, whatever their background and so on, were a very strong family unit. And that was what Diana had always missed. That was really the thematic tragedy of her life. Her own family breaking up when she was 6. Her marriage, into which she put so much goodwill and love and investment, breaking up in rather sad circumstances. All her life she had an enormous amount of love to give and was constantly being rejected. And I think one of the reasons that she really liked that Fayed family, and Mohammed Al Fayed had been a close friend of her father's and was almost like a fond uncle to her, was this very strong sense of being looked after, being part of a bonded unit that she'd always been denied. And that's why I think that relationship
worked for everyone. Her love of the Red Cross, her love of the people who worked in the Red Cross. She had a great passion for that charity. I always said you don't need to be an ambassador while you work for the Red Cross. You remain a bigger figure in a way. So that, the money she raised for the Red Cross at every level, and her caring about landmines, meant that she was able to combine the two. And they were two very different things. I mean, she realized she had this ability to raise vast sums of money for worthwhile charities, but she also realized that by just going to minefields and being there with children brought a tremendous awareness. She knew what that could do and what it meant.
Now, I know you said you didn't want to talk about this because obviously of the tragic events overnight, but it is going to have to be addressed in the next week, the role of the press. I mean, it is going to take on extra momentum now, isn't it?
Oh, I'm sure there'll be a tremendous discussion. I'm sure there will be a lot of words written and said. I'm afraid at the moment I can only think of her as this beautiful and amusing woman who did so much good. Now, there are going to be people who say there was another side. There are with all human beings. But when the balance is weighed, she added considerably to the lives of the people of this country and was a great ambassador and a great humanitarian person.
Yeah, I know. We all know that. And as I say, the nation will be grieving this morning. Whatever you might think of the royal family, whatever you thought of Diana, you'll join in Lord Archer's sentiments this morning. Actually, Lord Archer, can you just pass me that paper here? Thank you very much. Because this, unfortunately, is the news you're waking up to this morning. Diana, Princess of Wales, is dead. It's 8:15 on Sunday, the 31st of August, 1997. It is a day that will be etched in our memories for the rest of our lives, because that story, as I said, is true. Diana has lost her life in a car accident. She was just 36 years old.
I've been allowed to share your thoughts and dreams, your disappointments and your happiness. You have also given me an education by teaching me more about life and living than any books or teachers could have done. My debt of gratitude to you all is immense. I hope in some small way I have been of service in return.
Diana, Princess of Wales. She was, said Prime Minister Tony Blair, a wonderful, warm and compassionate person who people, not just in Britain but around the world, loved, and she'll be mourned as a friend. President Clinton says he is profoundly saddened. He says Hillary and I were very fond of her, and Mother Teresa is said to be praying for
the princess's body will be brought home, what arrangements to be made for her funeral, all those sort of things will come out through the palace. Do we anticipate anything at all today?
Well, it's hard to say. I would imagine that we would hear something, but of course they are in Balmoral, as I said. The two princes were very, very sad. So one would imagine that after the initial shock, more information from the palace. Certainly, whether a private funeral will be accepted by the public here at Buckingham Palace this morning.
Tanya, thank you very much for joining us. Well, this morning the question is to what extent the alleged high-speed chase involving the press photographers contributed to the death of the princess, her friend and their driver. Nicholas Glass looks back now at the difficult and complicated relationship between the princess and the press.
She was always news. For 17 years, news. She complained sometimes bitterly, despairingly of the attention, the constant following by photographers. Although it was an ambivalent relationship, she sometimes needed the press too. Ever since the story of her friendship with Dodi Fayed became known, the princess was, perhaps more than ever before, the subject of intense media attention. There was an auction for the first photos of them together. They went for hundreds of thousands of pounds. There was hardly any newspaper which didn't report the story. A spokesman for Mohammed Al Fayed said in the last few hours, "There is no doubt in Mr. Al Fayed's mind that this tragedy would not have occurred but for the press photographers who have dogged and pursued Mr. Fayed and the princess for weeks. This sort of pursuit is unacceptable. The Fayed family and the princess's family put up with the press in Saint-Tropez with good humour, but they should not have had to endure such intrusion which cannot be justified." This was Saint-Tropez just 2 weeks ago. The level of press interest was obvious from the battery of telephoto lenses in attendance.
With the freelance, whether it's a British freelance or anybody else in the world, they're answerable to nobody. So you can't really do anything about them. I mean, you might be able to make a personal face-to-face appeal to them, which is very unlikely. But no, the staff people are more likely to be responsive to requests for a bit of peace, a little bit of quiet.
But the freelancers, in your view, are a law unto themselves.
Yes, the freelancers, they know the demand is there for their pictures, and in some cases they will do more or less anything to get them.
That report from Nicholas Glass. We're joined now from central London by the constitutional specialist Dr. David Starkey, and here in the studio by the royal biographer Hugo Vickers. Hugo Vickers first. Here was a very young woman, plucked from the aristocracy but relative obscurity, cast upon the royal stage, apparently heaven sent in some ways, and now taken from us in the most macabre and desperate way.
I think she will always be remembered as a very, very caring princess. Like all the princesses, all the most loved princesses in history, she had two particular gifts. One was an absolute natural affinity with children, and two was a very genuine care of the sick, which of course in her age, in her era, she turned towards her care for AIDS patients, HIV sufferers. And these two things are something that cannot be faked. They were absolutely genuine, and I think that's what it was. I mean, you could say that all her gifts and all her problems stemmed from the fact that she had a heart.
She was also a victim of her age, wasn't she?
She was a tremendous victim of her age. There will obviously be a lot of discussion about the role of the press. When she first married, she was told, look, there will be a lot of interest in you, but it will wear off. As she herself has said, it didn't wear off. In fact, it continued and it increased. It never ceased.
David Starkey, I mean, boldly, that there are no great constitutional consequences. Would that be a correct statement, desperate though this tragic news is?
There are no constitutional consequences at all. Diana, with her divorce, stepped outside the inner circle of the royal family. She ceased to be a royal highness and so on. But obviously, she remains the mother of William and Henry, Charles's former wife, and, as Hugo Vicker was saying, uniquely popular and uniquely central to the affections of the people. This means that she's more than royal.
Yes, and in that sense, therefore, and one hates to rush into the question of her funeral, but one would normally expect somebody of her status to get a state funeral. Do you see that as on or off as a result of her not being technically within the circle any longer?
I would have thought that there would almost certainly be some sort of state funeral. The trouble is, Diana spent the whole of her life breaking rules. There are no rules for Diana. There's been nobody in this status ever before. We don't know what will happen. Interestingly enough, I suppose the last comparable example is Queen Caroline, the wife of George IV, and they didn't want her to have a public funeral, and the people gave her one. They seized the coffin and they carried it shoulder high. I think the people will want to see Diana carried. They'll want to mourn somehow, however private the final interment may be.
Hugo Vickers, what's your sense in terms of what will happen to her funeral? I mean, technically she would not be accorded, one imagines, the full royal funeral that she would have had she still been married to the heir to the throne.
Well, I think she certainly did have a royal funeral all arranged at the time when she was married to the Prince of Wales. I imagine that there would be discussions, particularly with her two boys. I mean, Prince William is really of an age now to make that decision for himself, guided, no doubt, by his family. I completely agree with David Starkey. There would be an enormous public showing of grief, and something needs to be done. The
car apparently overturned in a tunnel. They've detained several photographers for questioning. Here there have already been calls for laws to curb press intrusion. Our media correspondent Nick Hyam now examines the princess's relationship with the press.
From the moment her relationship with the heir to the throne became public, the young Diana Spencer found herself the focus of intense media interest. To begin with, it was her innocence on which the photographers focused. But within weeks of her wedding, the strain of the exposure was beginning to tell. Buckingham Palace was asking editors to treat her gently. But she was too glamorous, her role too close to fairy tale to ignore. When her marriage failed, the media's obsession only intensified. In a speech after her separation, she recalled the impact of it all.
When I started my public life 12 years ago, I understood the media might be interested in what I did. I realized then their attention would inevitably focus on both our private and public lives. But I was not aware of how overwhelming that attention would become.
She became adept at manipulating the media. At the Taj Mahal on a trip to India, she posed alone and soulful as her marriage broke up. She allowed her friends to brief Andrew Morton, author of a revelatory biography, and she gave an interview to the BBC's Panorama without telling her press secretary. In it, she reiterated her complaints against photographers.
I never know where a lens is going to be. A normal day would be followed by 4 cars. A normal day would come back to my car and find 6 freelance photographers jumping around me. Some people would say, well, if you had a policeman, it'd make it easier. It doesn't at all. They've decided that I'm still a project after 15, 16 years that sells well.
The freelance paparazzi she especially detested stalked her every move in search of revealing photographs to sell for tens, sometimes hundreds of thousands of pounds around the world. On more than one occasion, she retaliated, this time by snatching the keys of a photographer's motorcycle. These photographs sold for $200,000 in America. The British tabloids, she called them ferocious only last week, bought the pictures as well, even if their staff photographers in recent years stuck mainly to officially sanctioned photo opportunities. Last night, fellow celebrities attacked the paparazzi.
I've actually been in that same tunnel being chased by paparazzis, and they run lights and they chase you and harass you the whole time. It happens all over the world. You don't know what it's like being chased by them. It is harassment under the under the guise of we are the press, we are entitled, and when people are having a private moment, they should be allowed to have a private moment.
The princess's death dominates this morning's newspapers, but Britain's press denies responsibility for the activities of freelancers and says there's no need for tighter controls.
Diana was unique. She had a unique relationship with the public, and the media were the way many times she communicated with the public. She had a place in the hearts of the public, and I don't think we'll see that same press attention for another person really again.
In recent months, the princess had used her attractiveness to the media to win publicity for the campaign against landmines, visiting Bosnia and Angola. One veteran journalist who accompanied her says her death will provoke new calls for privacy laws or action by newspapers themselves.
It is for the media not to blame all, shrug their shoulders and blame it all on the paparazzi, but to ask themselves whether the marketing system which they've set up for these photographs contributed to this tragedy.
It isn't only the reporters and photographers, it's those who hired them, it's those who pay for their photographs, it's the editors and proprietors who too often offer glossy excuses about the public interest, who need now, I think, to examine their consciences and their public duty.
Princess Diana had become an icon of beauty, of celebrity and of glamour, someone the media celebrated. The manner of her death may also make her the media's victim. Nick Hyam, BBC News.
Well, the royal biographer Anthony Holden and the BBC's court correspondent Jenny Bond are with me here in the studio. But first, for the reaction from the United States, I'm joined from Washington by our correspondent Tom Carver. Tom, the news came pretty late in the night in Washington. How are politicians and the media reacting over there?
Well, as you know, Princess Diana was an extremely popular figure over in America, and all the bulletins have been running throughout the night, fairly continuous updates on the tragic events, even though, as you say, it is now nearly 3:30 in the morning. President Clinton and Mrs. Clinton are on holiday up in Martha's Vineyard, a very exclusive island on the East Coast. They have issued a statement through a spokesman in which they say, "Hillary and I knew Princess Diana. We were very fond of her, and we are profoundly saddened by this tragic event. Our thoughts and prayers tonight are with her family, friends, and especially her children." Her spokesman said that they were at a party at a friend's house on the island when they were told of the news. They followed it on television, and when they finally heard that Diana had indeed died, they were visibly upset. They embraced, and they left the party soon afterwards.
And the princess, of course, was immensely popular in Britain, but was a real icon in the United States.
Yes, she was. She never suffered that dip in popularity that happened in the last few years in Britain. To her, to millions of Americans, Diana really was the royal family, even though she was actually divorced from Prince Charles. Most Americans still regarded her as the embodiment of the British royalty. And she had what for Americans was a deeply attractive combination of that Hollywood star quality combined with the royal mystique. And as you say, she was extremely popular and will now become an almost saint-like figure, I think, over here.
And was she happier in the United States because it was a freer society where what she represented was perhaps more respected than it may have been by some people in Britain or Europe?
Well, she still suffered harassment from photographers in the way that obviously stars in Hollywood do, but it never seemed to bother her quite as much. It wasn't as intrusive, partly because obviously America is a much bigger country, but also there wasn't that criticism, that critical edge to it all. Americans were very uncritical in their support and liking for her. Whenever she went to the White House, for instance, that was always the hottest tickets to get hold of for any sort of function with Diana. So really, for her, America was a sort of second home, I think, in many ways, where she knew she would always get a tremendous welcome.
Tom Carver in Washington, thank you very much indeed. And Tony Holden, was there a kind of, as some people have been suggesting earlier this morning, a kind of inevitability about all this, because there was this pursuit by the paparazzi which went on over weeks, months and years? Was there a kind of feeling among some people that perhaps it had to end this way?
Well, it's all still sinking in, isn't it? I was thinking while listening to your Washington correspondent, could this have happened in this country? I think these paparazzi are perhaps more unbridled on the continent of Europe. And as your Washington man was saying, all overseas publicity, particularly in America for Diana, tended to be completely adoring and positive. But these guys, as we know from the famous original shots of Diana and Dodi on holiday, that man made £3 million out of one set of photographs taken in 5 minutes, which were rather blurred. That's why these people are on these motorbikes pursuing them. In this country, I think there's been, recently anyway, more of an understanding that, okay, the press coverage may be negative at times, okay, maybe she doesn't like that, there are ways of coming back. But although she was followed wherever she went, she wasn't quite harassed on that scale.
And yet at the same time, she did have to take out an injunction to stop one particular photographer pursuing her.
This is true. I think she herself did make a distinction, and I think as people learn this news and feelings begin to rise today, it is important to say, as I did briefly earlier, that it's important to make a distinction between the staff who work for newspapers in this country, who occasionally get things wrong. One thinks of The Sun and that video 6 months ago, which they have duly apologized for, and these unlicensed freelance paparazzi who really, for years, some of us have been saying editors should not use these photographs, and these people wouldn't make this money, and then they wouldn't pursue her in this way.
Tony, thank you for that. We'll come back to you in just a moment, but we have here the newspapers, late editions, special late editions, which have been produced long after Fleet Street would normally have gone to bed. As you can see, the papers haven't caught up with the fact that the Princess of Wales has in fact died. The Sunday Times, Dodi killed, Diana badly injured in a car crash. Paparazzi pursuit ends in tragedy inside Paris tunnel. And here in the Sunday Mirror, 1 a.m. news, Dodi dead, Diana hurt in smash. Princess Diana's lover, Dodi Fayed, was killed early today in a horrific car crash in Paris. Witnesses said Dodi had been given heart massage by the side of the road and described the inside of the couple's limousine as being full of blood. And the people, Dodi dead, Diana hurt in smash horror. Princess Diana was badly hurt and Dodi Fayed killed in a car crash in Paris earlier today. And details, more details inside, but of course not the detail which has dominated our programme here this morning, which is that the Princess of Wales has in fact died in hospital after that car smash in a tunnel in Paris. Jenny Bond, our court correspondent, is with me. Jenny, what were Diana's feelings for the Prince of Wales and his relationship with Camilla?
Well, she told me a few months ago that she bore no animosity towards Camilla Parker Bowles, even though, as she so famously stated, there were always, in her view, 3 of them in the marriage and that it was very crowded. She told me that she never regretted marrying Prince Charles, even though she felt she had suffered enormously through the marriage. Through that suffering, she felt she had learned to be a better, stronger, bigger person. And she said she just didn't regret her decision to marry at all. And furthermore, she said that she recognised that Camilla Parker Bowles was the love of Prince Charles's life. And she told me rather extraordinarily that she actually thought that Camilla deserved some recognition because she had been such a long-standing lover and had been so loyal and discreet. Those were her words.
Recognition going as far as marriage. Would she have endorsed that?
I don't think she would have endorsed that. I did ask her what did she mean by recognition, and she wasn't quite sure what she meant, but some public recognition. She did feel that there was no need for them to marry. She felt they possibly could go on as they were. And she said, of course, of her and Prince Charles, she said, I just look back and I do still love Prince Charles. I'm not in love with him, but I do still love him, she said, which surprised me. And she said, what a great couple we would have been.
And it was poignant to look back at moments a few weeks ago when she and the Prince did appear in public with their sons and looked to have an affection for them which clearly transcended all that had gone before.
Well, the Prince certainly, yes, appeared with the sons up at Balmoral at a photo call.
I was thinking of before that, when they appeared at the Prince's school.
Oh yes, that's going back a couple of years. Yes, they never disagreed over the children. That was one thing. Whatever fights were going on between them about everything else and the settlement of the divorce, over the children, I am told, by both parties, they were absolutely resolute and did not disagree. So of course our thoughts must turn to the children, and some of the tributes that are coming in now are mentioning
just
that, of
before you
course.
move on to those, let me just ask Tony about that relationship between the Prince and the Princess in the wake of the divorce. Was there a kind of deep understanding growing of each other's position?
I think there was, and I think there was a lot of mutual respect, and above all, unlike some divorced couples, they didn't squabble over the children, and they worked very hard to make life as easy as possible in the circumstances for the children. It just occurred to me, listening to Jenny, I agreed with everything that she said, that I think there were plans this autumn, ironically enough, for Prince Charles and Diana to make an appearance together with the children, possibly on Britannia's perhaps last voyage back from Scotland. They were working towards that direction of reminding the nation that whatever else was going on in their lives, they were the parents of these children, and in these unprecedented royal circumstances, there was still a strong bond between both parents and children.
Now, obviously our thoughts at this time are with other members of the royal family, particularly the Princess's sons, William and Harry. Do you think it is going to be extremely difficult for them, who already were in the business of having to live this kind of split and divided life? Is it going to be particularly difficult for them to come to terms with what has happened in the early hours of this morning?
I think poor William and Harry have already had immensely difficult lives up to their young ages, and they're obviously going to be utterly devastated, and may take a long time, if ever, to get over this. She was a very unusual royal mother. I was very interested in one of the quotes in the Le Monde interview last week, which got lost amid all the furore, was it talking about her father, Earl Spencer, had always taught her to treat everybody as equals, and she tried to get that across to William and Harry. And I think the way that she, having lived outside the royal family as a child, on the edge of it, but she had led a comparatively normal life. She used to take them shopping, she used to make them stand in queues and pay. This was never done for Prince Charles when he was a child. Perhaps he's suffered as a result. And Diana was an enormous force for good in the way that our future King William was brought up, and of course his brother.
So very briefly, she may have brought him up to be a king for the people.
Exactly. She used that phrase in the famous Panorama interview about the monarchy walking hand in hand with the people more than it did, and that was the kind of king she was trying to breed.
Tony, Jenny, thank you for the moment. And just to recap, Diana, Princess of Wales, has died after a car crash in Paris. She was taken to hospital in the early hours of this morning. Surgeons tried to save her life for 2 hours, but she died at 4 o'clock. In a statement, Buckingham Palace said, "The Queen and the Prince of Wales are deeply shocked and distressed by this terrible news." Diana, Princess of Wales, had been a passenger in a car which crashed in a tunnel next to the River Seine. Her friend, Dodi Fayed, and their driver were also killed. The accident happened as press photographers pursued the Princess's car through a tunnel under the Place de l'Alma in the centre of the city. The Princess's Mercedes hit a road pillar and smashed into a wall. 7 photographers were arrested after the incident. Alison Holt now reports.
Twisted almost beyond recognition, the wreckage of the Mercedes in which the Princess was travelling. The crash happened shortly after midnight. According to eyewitnesses, the car hit a wall in a tunnel on one of the fast-flowing roads which runs alongside the River Seine. They were apparently being pursued at high speed by photographers on motorbikes. Within minutes of the crash, the area was sealed off as police and ambulance teams struggled to reach the 4 trapped inside. Dodi Al-Fayed, the Princess's constant companion in recent weeks, was dead at the scene, as was their chauffeur. The Princess and her bodyguard had to be cut from the wreckage. Both were taken to hospital with serious injuries. But those who witnessed the aftermath of the accident knew the gravity of what they were seeing.
We saw a large blue Mercedes, darker blue, and the airbag on the passenger side was deployed. And we saw a lot of liquid on the ground, and we didn't know who it was at the time. Somebody came running towards us, speaking French, shouting in French, and we thought for some reason it was going to blow up in the tunnel. We stood there, watched a little bit, and police came about 7 to 10 minutes later, ambulance about 15 minutes later.
Immediately after the crash, police took away a motorbike for further investigation. The high-speed chase with photographers on bikes pursuing the car is thought to have begun as the couple left the Ritz Hotel, where they'd been having dinner. The hotel belongs to Mr. Al-Fayed's father, and the man driving them was a security agent from the Ritz. Police have arrested 5 photographers, and one is said to have been beaten up by someone who saw the accident. Certainly, eyewitnesses say the paparazzi were on the scene within seconds.
I was one of the first 3 people in the tunnel. The driver was unconscious, sounding the horn for like probably almost 2 minutes. Well, initially when I approached the vehicle, the gentleman who was taking pictures, and his camera equipment was far too sophisticated for a tourist or someone not professional, I assumed, associated with the press.
But whilst police began to gather evidence for their investigation into what had happened, and less than 5 hours after the accident, the announcement was made that Diana, Princess of Wales, had died in hospital. The first government reaction came from the other side of the world, where the Foreign Secretary is visiting the Philippines.
I am greatly shocked by this news. Our first thoughts must be with her children and with her family at this time of immense loss to them. I was fortunate to have the opportunity of working with the Princess on her international charity work. I believe what has happened is a tragic loss at a young age of someone who'd shown great courage and commitment in drawing attention to serious issues. For the next few days, her family and the nation must have time to come to terms with their immense sadness and loss. In the longer term, serious questions will need to be asked as to whether the aggressive intrusion into her privacy has contributed to this tragedy.
Those are questions which will be asked in coming days, but at the moment the investigation has only just begun, and few have yet grasped the full impact of this tragedy. Alison Holt, BBC News.
And we're getting reports that police in Paris are saying it is too early to say whether the 7 paparazzi who pursued the Princess of Wales car would be charged with any offence. The men were being questioned as witnesses to the accident, according to a report from Paris. Princess Diana supported many charities and causes. One of the people she came to know well was the leading heart surgeon, Sir Magdi Yacoub. A short time ago, he paid tribute to the work the princess had done.
I'm absolutely devastated. I think it's a fantastic loss, great loss. I describe her as a person who's very warm, very concerned, typifies the best of human qualities. I mean, a really extraordinary person. She had deep, genuine concern for the plight, for example, of heart patients, children, others from different countries, from this country. And she wanted to know more. I mean, really, she was highly intelligent, sensitive, wanting to find out what hurts these people. Can she do something about it? How can she be part of this? How can she help? I wanted to know. This inquisitive, strong mind. This is incredible.
Well, joining our court correspondent Jenny Bond now is Susie Parsons from the London Lighthouse, a hospice which specialises in AIDS patients and which the Princess visited regularly. Can you tell me the impact of her work for the London Lighthouse?
Well, she was the most tremendous supporter of London Lighthouse, and in a very personal capacity. She did come nearly a year ago now to launch a major capital appeal for funds for the Lighthouse, but it's not so much that we will remember, although we do thank her for it. It's the very personal, the very warm sense that she brought. Many of our service users have met her several times over the years, because she would very often come just on a very private, informal visit, which never got into the press, and just visit people and talk with them. And there is just the most tremendous sense of loss and shock at Lighthouse now, because we really did feel very, very close to her.
Susie, many charities, not just the Lighthouse, talk about the incredible magnetism that she had and this incredibly special rapport with people. How would you sum that up?
It was extraordinary. I mean, I've never seen anybody be able to come into a group of people who would perhaps be a bit nervous about meeting a princess and so on, and within about 2 minutes she'd have them laughing and joking, and she'd really put them at their ease. And it was always, when she came, it was always a very you know, a lot of fun, not heavy at all. She was just had this ability to really make people relax and talk to them just as a person, and they'd really forget that she was a princess and just deal with her as a real person.
And what kind of things did the patients say after her visit was over? Oh,
well, she's just like us, isn't she? Isn't she wonderful? You know, she's just a real person. That was very much the feeling that people have, and that I think it's irreplaceable. And you know, it just is a most tremendous loss to us all, really.
Have the patients at the London Lighthouse been told this morning about what has happened?
Yes, those who are well enough will already have been
Do you know what their reaction was?
As I say, the most tremendous feeling of loss and shock. In fact, we were expecting her, and I wouldn't have been saying this in other circumstances, but we were expecting her for a visit the week after next, just a very private visit, which would never have been in the press or on the television or anything. And you know, it's terrible to think now that she won't be coming, and she won't be coming anymore. And that's very much the reaction that people have now that they've heard this dreadful news.
Her diary for years was filled with many charitable engagements. What do you think her contribution was to the voluntary sector in Britain? How will the voluntary sector as a whole remember her?
I think obviously as somebody who helped us in our fundraising efforts by raising the profile of the organisations that she worked with, and I mean that's very important for all charities, but overwhelmingly I think as somebody who brought just that very personal touch, and who had a real sense of commitment and a real understanding of the very complicated issues that she got involved with. I mean, homelessness, landmines, HIV, these are very complex matters, and she really did have a great understanding, certainly in my experience, of HIV and its effects on people's lives, and a compassion that it really touched everybody's heart, I think.
Do you recall the impact of that handshake with an AIDS patient?
Absolutely. I mean,
what did that do for people with AIDS and those who were looking after them?
I think that was tremendously important. It's a while ago now, and fortunately, although some people, you know, there is still a stigma attached to being HIV positive, to having AIDS, it's very much less than it was those years ago. And I think that Princess Diana, sitting on somebody's bed and holding their hand, a person with AIDS, that just had the most tremendous effect, both in terms of how those people who perhaps didn't have a very good understanding of HIV and AIDS viewed it. People felt less scared because the princess was able to do that. But also in terms of people who are HIV positive, just that feeling that a member of the royal family, this very special and important person, would do that and would sit and chat and hold hands with somebody was extremely important, I think.
Well, Susie Parsons, thank you for adding to the welter of tributes that are coming in for the Princess of Wales. In fact, Jenny, you have many more.
There are many more, yes. Another from one of the charities she still supported. The English National Ballet said that it would be a tremendous loss. She's just irreplaceable. And from around the world tributes, President Chirac in France has said he learnt with great shock of the princess's death. She was a young woman, a woman of our age, warm, full of life and generosity. Her death would be deeply felt because she was such a familiar figure to everyone, and I think that's very true. And in Scotland, the moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, the Right Reverend Sandy MacDonald, said the people of the Church of Scotland and the whole of Scotland would be deeply shocked, and what would be uppermost in everyone's minds, he said, would be concern for the children, of course.
Jenny, we heard from Susie just a moment ago about what the Princess did for other people. What do you think the Princess herself got out of these visits?
I think she told me that she drew enormous strength from these people. She saw their suffering and yet saw how they endured and carried on with their lives. And it made her feel strong and it made her feel full, is what she said. She said when she got back to the palace, she felt terribly empty. And she also felt in the sadness of her marriage, there was no one to replenish that emptiness. And I think by going out and carrying on with this work, she fulfilled her life.
But those visits to charitable organisations gave her a kind of strength that enabled her to deal with the various crises in her personal life.
Indeed, I think so. I think she would not have quarrelled with the idea that she became almost addicted, if you like, to going out and doing this good work, because she had such a powerful sense of vocation.
Jenny and Susie, thank you very much for joining us. And we have one extra piece of news, that French police are reported to have said that the body of Diana, Princess of Wales, will be flown back to Britain later today. Well, members of the public have already been paying their own tributes. Flowers have been laid at Kensington Palace and at Buckingham Palace. Clarence Mitchell reports.
From first light at Kensington Palace, people had begun laying flowers. Those paying their respects to the Princess outside her official London home, united by a stunned sense of utter disbelief at what had happened overnight in Paris.
She touched groups of people that had never been touched by the royal family before. She did, for example, in the case of AIDS, she did so much to change public attitudes just by very simple things, by touching people's hands and by holding them.
She was just a shining light, and she was there for everybody. And I'm just glad towards the end she found happiness. At least she died knowing real happiness, I think.
She was just a wonderful person. I think that she's completely irreplaceable. I don't think anyone could take her place, and I think it's going to leave a terrible void in everybody's lives, especially her two sons.
She meant a lot to me. The fact is that Diana is one of the members of the royal family that the nation identifies with most, and the fact that she did a lot of work for the charities really touched my heart. And although I'm not really a royalist, I really feel compelled to come here this morning and leave these flowers for her. I'm just completely shocked. It just sounds so absurd that, well, the best one of the lot had to go first.
And at Buckingham Palace too, similar scenes. The grief being immediately felt on the streets of the capital is undoubtedly a mere foretaste of the national mourning yet to come. Clarence Mitchell, BBC News.
Well, now let's catch up with our correspondents around the country. Joining me first from Kensington Palace is Steve Evans. Steve, I see crowds already beginning to gather there.
That's right. There's a file of people down this alleyway to the gates of Kensington Palace, where they are placing flowers, simple flowers often. The first one at 5:30 this morning, a bunch of white lilies wrapped in newspaper, and since then, ordinary flowers have been going down with handwritten inscriptions. It shouldn't have happened to you. We will miss you, that kind of thing. There's also a media gathering here, as you can probably see. But actually what's really happening here is most people are just standing around simply looking. There is a stunned disbelief here, really, I think.
Yes, because it is clearly going to be some time before the people in Britain come to terms with what has happened. She was so much a part of the British scene and indeed of people's hearts.
That's right. This is the middle of one of the entertainment areas of London, and a lot of people early on were people going home from the night out. And these, in a way, were Diana's people. A lot of gay people have come up and said, echoing previous thoughts, that the one moment when she touched them, as it were, was when she touched that that AIDS patient in the hospital. So a lot of ordinary people have taken time out to come here and express that sentiment.
Steve, thank you. Neil Bennett is at Buckingham Palace. Neil, what's the reaction there?
Well, the same sense of shock and grief, and this is obviously going to be a natural focal point for the nation's sadness today. And within the past half hour, the police have been clearing people away a little bit back from Buckingham Palace and put out metal barriers, because they're obviously expecting that a lot more ordinary people will be coming here during the day just to make their own direct personal contribution to the nation's grief.
So we're talking about a silent mourning in front of Buckingham Palace.
Yes, we're talking about just very simple, very direct gestures that people felt that they had to make at the moment they heard the news. The first person here was a minicab driver who heard the news on the radio. He went straight into an all-night store and bought a bunch of flowers and came down here and put it down by the gates of Buckingham Palace. The news was announced to a group of youngsters in a nightclub in the West End. The DJ announced the news, the nightclub immediately emptied. Groups of young people came down here at about 5 o'clock in the morning, all of them carrying single red roses. They laid them down by the gates of Buckingham Palace, and they said they'd done so simply because they wanted to express their feeling that Diana had been an inspiration to young people.
Neil, thank you. And joining me from Harrods is our correspondent, Duncan Kennedy. Duncan, Harrods, of course, is the empire which Dodi Fayed was going to inherit had he lived from his father. So a deep sense of sadness there as well.
Exactly that, Martin. Dodi was the eldest of 5 children, and he would have inherited it, being the eldest child. You can see from Harrods behind me here, the flags are flying at half-mast, the Union Jacks here, and also a number of bouquets of flowers have been placed in the door handles of this most famous store, many of them in Arabic language, from the Al Fayed Egyptian family, of course. But there's one rather poignant one in English, a simple little card saying, sorry, the only word on that card. There have also been other people turning up here, many tourists, because Harrods obviously is a world-famous store. One nun who was visiting London came up to us and said she heard the news on BBC Radio this morning, and all she could do was say a prayer, having heard that news. And there was one other man who was an Australian man. His daughter was watching some cricket in Australia. The information was flashed up on the information board at that cricket match. She rang him, and he felt as though he had to come to somewhere to express his grief.
Duncan, thank you. And Robin Oakley is at Downing Street. Robin, the reaction there?
Well, Tony Blair took the view, the Prime Minister, that Princess Diana was a huge asset to Britain, and I understand he is going to get involved in the funeral arrangements. Obviously, we'll be talking to the palace authorities at some later stage to see what can be done to mark the nation's mourning. But politicians mostly are struggling for the right words of dismay and horror at this tragedy, and I think Paddy Ashdown probably got closest to it when he talked about a star burning brightly, being extinguished from people's lives.
And any arrangements for the funeral yet? We did hear earlier that the body of the Princess of Wales is being flown back to London later today.
No, we don't have any detailed news yet of any funeral arrangements. That will come a little bit later in the proceedings. I think for the moment the chief concern is with the family's grief and with the 2 boys who are left without a mother.
Robin Oakley in Downing Street, thank you very much indeed. And